My name is Muslim Farouk, and as you've heard, I'm a lawyer and the CEO of the National Council of Canadian Muslims, and I'm joined today by my colleague Samiha Omar, who's the Director of Legal Affairs for the Council. By way of background, NCCM was founded as an independent, nonpartisan, and nonprofit grassroots organization dedicated to defending the human rights and civil liberties of Muslim communities living in Canada. For almost 2 decades, we have been a leading voice in the promotion of human rights in Canada, working tirelessly in the areas of community education and outreach, media engagement, and public advocacy, challenging discrimination and Islamophobia. With the independently documented rise in hate, racism, and Islamophobia faced by our communities, we are here today because we are greatly concerned about public safety. I think this came to a clear head for me personally when over this weekend, I introduced members of the Quebec City Mosque with members of the London Muslim community at the funeral of the Afzal family. And then I drove back to Toronto to try to attend a vigil at the IMO Mosque in Etobicoke. The reality is that something has gone terribly wrong in this country. The reality is that while I was preparing for this committee last night I was also at the IIT, the Islamic Institute of Toronto, after 2 individuals yesterday threatened to bomb the center after attempting to break in. And we were reaching out to a Black Muslim woman allegedly assaulted in Edmonton. And we were in conversation with the Beit al-Hadi Center in Edmonton that had a swastika drawn on it. On the evening of January 29th, an armed male entered the CCIQ in Quebec and gunned down 6 Muslim worshippers and injured several more in a terrorist attack targeting a masjid and the Muslims inside it. The victims were Ibrahim Aberi, Azzuddin Sufyan, Abu Bakr Thabti, Khalid Belkacemi, Mamadou Tanuberi, and Abdul Karim Hassan. In an instance of hate and violence, their earthly presence was taken from us in what remains the worst attack on a house of worship on Canadian soil in modern history. On the evening of September 12th, 2020, a man with alleged links to a white supremacist group, the O9A, walked onto the parking lot of the IMO Mosque in Etobicoke and slit the throat of Mohammed Aslam Zabas. I saw his body that night in the parking lot, even as I had met him that year, handing out food to the poor in the worst of the COVID-19 epidemic. On June 7th, a family was run down in London by an accused with alleged hate-based motivation. Terrorism charges have now been brought against the accused. I'm going to read the names of the deceased into the record. Salman Afzal and his mother, his wife Madiha Salman, their daughter Yumna. Before leaving London, I met the young child, the sole survivor of the attack. I don't really have words to fully describe what that meant. We are here today because white supremacist, violent Islamophobic, neo-Nazi, and alt-right groups are growing precipitously. And they're becoming bolder. Whether it's groups like the Soldiers of Odin surveilling a mosque in BC, a group calling itself the Clan intimidating worshippers at Canada's oldest mosque in Edmonton, groups like Les Meutes in Quebec, or the groups that are now planning celebrations of the London terror attack in Ontario. This is to exclude all of the other things that I was dealing with yesterday. Amongst others, in Calgary, a woman wearing a burqa was allegedly accosted. But as my colleague Samiha can tell you, this is pretty much a consistent occurrence for us. We get these calls 365 days a year. My submissions before you today are squarely around how we can dismantle white supremacist and neo-Nazi groups that first act as a major source of inciting and enabling hate, xenophobia, and violence against certain segments of the public, including members of the Muslim community. I will also note that our colleagues who joined us today from CIJA joined with us earlier this year, or last year, in our call for more action around white supremacist groups in tandem with dozens of leading Canadian organizations. Just in the interest of time, I'll dive right into the recommendations that we want to highlight before this committee. These key recommendations and approaches are ones that we will further discuss at the National Action Summit on Islamophobia, which I appreciate also had important bipartisan support. And from our perspective, these need to be undertaken in order to dismantle the immediate challenges around white supremacist groups in Canada. First of all, we believe that existing Crim Code provisions, especially the terror listing provisions of the ATA and Section 70 of the Criminal Code, should be used to dismantle groups like the Three Percenters. Even as this government utilized current legislative options in dismantling white supremacist groups like Blood and Honor and Combat 18, the Proud Boys, and Tuathan, we believe that the tools already exist in the Criminal Code to list terrorist groups and to disband militias. These provisions need to be used to deal with the other 250 plus white supremacist organizations in Canada. Section 70 of the Criminal Code, for instance, deals with prohibiting assemblies of persons for the training of or drilling themselves, being trained or drilled to the use of firearms or practicing military exercises. This could be used to prevent the actions of groups and the mobilization of groups like the Three Percenters. And so when we're talking about ideologically motivated violent extremism, we need to recognize that there are already existing provisions in the criminal code that can be used to dismantle some of these groups. Secondly, we recommend the addition of new legislative listing provisions to the criminal code that specifically list white supremacist groups as white supremacist groups. Groups like the Soldiers of Odin may not meet the high threshold of being a listed terrorist entity and are not a militia. But these groups provide significant threats to Canadian Muslim communities, or like the organization that is planning on hosting a celebration of the London terror attack. There's no reason for these groups to allowed to continue to exist, congregate, mobilize, plan their hate in Canada.
Now, Mr. Farouk, can you just wind up, please?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thirdly, I think we need to see robust online hate regulation that is balanced and that ensures the protection of civil liberties, through consultation with the best experts in Canada internationally. And lastly, we would like to see a review in how national security agencies have been dealing with neo-Nazi and white supremacist groups. Thank you. I also note that we'll be providing a brief and follow-up to expand further on the recommendations.
I want to thank both of our witnesses for being here today. It was difficult to listen to your testimony. It's heartbreaking to know that both your communities are afraid to go out depending on what they're wearing. But I also know it's much more difficult to live that, which I don't. Mr. Farouk, I am just my sincere sympathy on the loss in London, Ontario, my hometown. One of the things, I attended a vigil last week in Oakville for the family that was killed in London. And one of the things that was brought up at the vigil, as well as by community leaders and constituents, has been the representation of the Muslim community in the media and how that has contributed to the rise of Islamophobia. And I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit about community building programs and other things that we can do to dispel that that perception in the media and amongst Canadians.
Well, I mean, I wish that I had all the answers to that question. I think it's a big question that I think we're all trying to grapple with, especially in an age where we consume and form opinions and perspectives so quickly on the online sphere. And I think we also have to be careful in talking about, how discourse is created, that we don't bend the page in the direction of limiting civil liberties. Ultimately, I think that that's harmful to the way that we as Canadians need to engage and talk to each other and think and work through these challenging times together. I think, though, that there are a number of critical steps that need to be taken so that Canadian Muslims, but also BIPOC folks in general, can tell their stories, can share with Canadians, can make space, and simultaneously, I think it's important that folks at all levels, especially in leadership levels, condemn when there's hateful messages that are put out there. I think sometimes we undervalue the importance of what leadership means. And I can tell you that in the aftermath of the London attack, seeing articles, in various newspapers with headlines, stating something to the effect of, are Canadian Muslims in danger? Nonsense. Or newspapers that came out the day after the London attack that didn't even acknowledge that it happened. These are things that, honestly, it hurts your heart to see, and I think we all have roles to play, not only in speaking up about it, but also producing programs that empower communities to tell their own stories.